Hello there, Stanton students. This is Mr. Tovry. Welcome to your philosophy lecture, one of my favorite subjects. We're going to cover Eastern and Western philosophy. So, again, this will relate to key concept 2.1, the development and codification of religious and cultural traditions. Review this key concept and take a look at how, as states and empires increase, cultural systems will be transformed. And so for this lecture, we're talking specifically about the philosophies or religions of China, mainly Confucianism and Daoism, and also in India of Buddhism. And then we'll talk about Greco-Roman philosophy, or the ancient philosophy that begins with the Greeks. So, what you should hope to accomplish by the end of this lecture is to be able to analyze the differences between what a philosophy is and what a religion is, how those things are different or perhaps similar. Explain the ideas surrounding these philosophies. What are their characteristics? Could you talk about them, explain them to someone else? The differences between East and Western philosophy, and to analyze the impact of these philosophies on the cultures around them. All right, so how do they contribute to the art around them, the literature, the ideas that influence gender relations, those types of things. Okay, so what is a philosophy in comparison to a religion? You might be able to distinguish these two in just a logical way, meaning that all religions contain philosophies, right? There's philosophy that's found in every religion. So, philosophy is a part of all religions. However, it doesn't work the same way, right? Philosophies aren't what we call a religion. So, both, however, are concerned with the nature of existence. They ask the question of what it means to be a human, and they can always be the basis for our laws. Both the ideas in philosophy or ideas in religion can be codified or written down and be applied to a law or to a government. Governments can use the ideas in philosophy and religions, right? Some examples of this, a modern example of this are the ideas that John Locke gives for the creation of the Declaration of Independence, right? Many of the ideas of the philosopher John Locke were used in the creation of the United States Declaration of Independence. To give you an example of how this happens in religion, many laws that are established in the Middle Ages in Europe are based in Christian law, and also those, underneath the empires, the Islamic empires, the Islamic caliphates of the same time period were based in Islamic law. All right, so here's the differences. Philosophy can be split into 6 major branches. It's debated sometimes about how many branches of philosophy there are, but the main ones are politics, asking the question of who ought to have power; ethics, what it means to be a good person, what it means for something to be right or wrong; logic is the study of how we form concepts and the relationships of concepts, and I'll give you an example of that here in a minute. Aesthetics is the study of beauty. What do we consider beautiful, or what do we consider art? Metaphysics is the study of things beyond physics, or that transcend physics, or the physical world. So this is a lot of questions about what the essence of objects are. Do things contain an essence? If you had a rock, one of the essence of a rock, we would say, would be that it's hard, right? It's dense, right? And so what do we mean when we say that word, that something's dense or hard? Like, what is the essence of hardness? might be a way of thinking about this. But metaphysics is also the question of things beyond the physical world, or things that are supernatural, right? And so this is questions about God, right? Also, questions about things that might not exist in the physical or natural world. And epistemology is the study of how we know things, how we come to know things. Later on here at Stanton, you'll probably take a class called TOK, or Theory of Knowledge. That's essentially what epistemology is. How do we come to know things? Is it merely through experience, how we see things and hear things, or how much is rationality involved in that? So, in comparison to that, religion is typically founded through a charismatic leader, one person who gains a following, and there is typically mythology associated around this figure, or mythology as to the creation of the world, and we'll see this in many different cultures, and not necessarily the large religions of today like Christianity and Judaism and Islam, but also origin mythologies of the religions of the Aztecs, for examples, of how the earth was created. So more obscure religions like that also have origins to them. And typically, this is a big difference between religion and philosophy. Oftentimes, religion is surrounded or is read through one sacred text. So the religion has one specific text for which a follower or an adherent of that religion goes to find out everything about that religion, all the ideas, the lineage, the patriarchy perhaps, and how to follow that religion. And so also therefore religion is greatly centered around rituals and ceremonies, oftentimes stated in that text as well, but not necessarily. And nonetheless, it does contain moral philosophy within it. Religion will talk about what a person should do to live a good life, and also it may discuss some metaphysical questions about God, of course. Okay, so something that is similar about both philosophy and religion is that both look to find universal truths about the world. And what I mean about that is truths that everyone can come to an agreement about, or that hold true in all circumstances, in every place, and for every person. Meaning that it's not relative. It doesn't depend on a person. It's not subjective. And so we could say that about things like 2 + 2 = 4, right? If you have 2 units of something and you add another 2 units to it, you're going to have 4 units. And that's a truth that doesn't depend on who you are, right? This is something that's universal for everyone. And so this is one of the main goals of philosophy. And this applies to both Eastern and Western philosophy. This was the goal of Confucius and Lao Tzu, people will talk about in a second, and also Socrates and Aristotle and Plato. They're all looking for these universal truths. And so we can think about it in terms of logical or mathematical truths, like 2 + 2 = 4. But it gets a little more tricky when we think about truths that everyone can apply to their lives. And so, take this quote by Aristotle, for example. Anybody can become angry. That's easy. But to be angry with the right person, and to the right degree, and at the right time, and for the right purpose, and in the right way is not within everybody's power and is not easy. So, that's a statement that I think a lot of us could agree on, right? that it's easy to just get angry at someone, but to do it in a certain way and to have it have the right effect and do it to the right degree, that's not an easy thing to do. And so this might be something that we could all agree on. We might say this is a universal truth, but it's not a truth in the same sense that 2 + 2 = 4, right? Okay, and then we can also have logical truths. And so if you look down at the bottom here, at the bottom right corner, we have a logical formation of the relationship of Socrates, who was a philosopher, to being mortal, right? To being able to die, right? And so this is a basic syllogism, is what we call this logical formation, that if Socrates is a man, and if all men are mortal, it therefore follows that Socrates must be mortal, right? And this is something that would have to be true in every circumstance, right? Just because it's logically true. And so, if Socrates is a man, all men are mortal, Socrates must be mortal. It must necessarily be true. So, it doesn't necessarily have to apply to just math. It also applies to how we form our concepts, okay? And just a side note down here at the bottom, this is something that that is interesting, is that all of the thinkers, or a lot of the thinkers we'll be talking about, are born about the same time, about the 6th century BCE, okay? And so just like, we see this interesting phenomenon of agriculture popping up in different parts of the world, people having these ideas about questioning their lives and what it means to be a good person and how one ought to live. Different people in different places, Confucius in China, Buddha in India, Socrates in the West, in Greece, all began having these ideas around the same time. Okay, so on to the Western Greek philosophers. This will set up the basis for Western philosophical thought until today. This is what we still base Western philosophy on. And as this quote suggests by Socrates, the unexamined life is not worth living. This is a good example of how the Greeks thought about, or how the Greeks wanted to change how they thought about the world. They wanted to examine every part of their lives because they thought it was important. And so the first of these philosophers were called the Sophists. And what the Sophists would do is they would travel from city to city in ancient Greece and basically charge people to have them philosophize to them, or teach them, basically. They're traveling teachers. And so it'd be like if you were walking around in downtown Jacksonville and somebody came up to you and said, "Hey, I'll teach you some chemistry. If you give me like $5, I'll teach you some chemistry here for like 5 minutes." So it sounds something that would be strange to us now. But they would also give people legal advice, and oftentimes we use this term now. We might call somebody a sophist to say that there's somebody who really just uses arguments as a trick to try and win that argument, just to get away with something, like to get out of being in trouble with the law or something like that. And so we often think of them as people who would trick people with arguments. Okay, so the big three Greek philosophers were Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Socrates was a sophist. He was one of these individuals. He was someone who would travel around, and he was known for teaching individuals in the streets of Athens. And Socrates is known for, I'm sure you've heard in your Great Books classes about the Socratic method. And this method is a method of skepticism. It concerns a dialogue with one individual and asks them to question their life, right? The unexamined life is not worth living. And he was considered with how one lives a moral life. And this phrase, all I know is nothing, all I know is I know nothing, is kind of a testament to his idea of skepticism, right? So we wanted to challenge individuals about what they really knew about their life. We don't actually have any writing from Socrates. All the writings that we have from him come from his student, Plato, who writes about him. So, this is an easy way to remember these three philosophers. Socrates was the mentor or teacher to Plato. Plato was his student. Plato then was the mentor or teacher to Aristotle. Aristotle was Plato's student. Okay, so that's an easy way to remember those. Plato was Socrates' student. Aristotle was Plato's student. And in this picture to the left here, the two men here in the center of the picture, the one in the red robe on the left, that depicts Plato. The one in the blue robe on the right depicts Aristotle. So Plato was the founder of the Academy of Athens, one of the first places of higher learning in Athens. And he's known for developing an idea of the hierarchy of forms. And a good way to think about this is that there is an ideal realm to everything that exists in the world. So let's take an easy object. Think about a chair. You have a chair in the real world, right? You might be sitting on a chair now. But for Plato, there exists in this ideal realm your idea of a chair. You could close your eyes and think of a chair, and if you wanted to, you could think of the perfect chair, and this would be the ideal chair, right? But the existence of that chair only exists in your mind, right? It only exists in this ideal realm. Okay, so that was the highest hierarchy of the form, right? That's the number one form would be the ideal realm, right? And so for Plato, the second best would be the actual chair here in real life. That this actual chair that you're sitting on, that's not as good as the ideal chair, right? And then for Plato, at least, even worse than that would be representations or pictures of a chair, right? Because then you couldn't even use it, and it wasn't even the real chair, it would just be an imitation of a chair, right? So that may sound weird, and why would anybody care about a chair? But Plato would apply this to other ideas as well. So not just physical objects, but things like courage, right? We might have examples of courage in the real world, but there always exists some ideal version of courage that you could think of. You can imagine an ideal scenario in which someone was courage, but that would never exist in the real world. It would always be an ideal for Plato. So, this is important for Western thought because people in the Middle Ages will use this idea as a justification for the existence of God as well. And so a lot of Plato and Aristotle's metaphysical thought will be used going on into the Middle Ages. Okay, and then just quickly, Aristotle really creates this comprehensive system of Western philosophy, essentially creating a Western philosophy that encompasses logic and metaphysics and epistemology, all of these things. And so if you want to think about philosophy in another way, really philosophy is what all the things we study now encompassed. So you think of science, philosophy included science, medicine, astrology, or astronomy rather, physics, all of these things were considered philosophy in ancient Greece. If I mention astrology, the sign for Cancer is, if you know, it's a crab. And Greek physicians made that term, or gave that symbol of a crab to cancer, because when they removed cancer from an individual, it was hard like a crab, and so that's where you get that symbol for that. But Aristotle's physics include the idea that the natural state of all objects is to be at rest. That's what Aristotle believed. And so imagine that you have a rock and you throw a rock as far as you can. Eventually, it's going to hit the ground and stop rolling and come to a stop, right? That's why Aristotle thought that all things strive to be at rest, because everything will eventually stop moving at one point. And so that's the physics of Aristotle that will hold all the way up until Isaac Newton. Because of course we know Isaac Newton for this idea that he's sitting under a tree and an apple hits his head. But really that's like a simplified version of that story. What Newton realized was that if he and his head and the earth were not in the way of that apple, that apple would simply continue moving, right, through space at a constant rate, at a constant speed, until something stopped it. So as opposed to Aristotle, who thought, hey, the natural state, the natural physical state of all objects is to be at rest, Newton said no. The natural state of all objects is to be moving in a constant line or a straight line at a constant speed. Okay. Buddhism originates in India, in the bottom of the Himalayan mountains in northeastern India, from an individual who is named Siddhartha Gautama. He was called that before he became the Buddha. And there's not much historical evidence for Siddhartha. And we believe he was born around in the 6th century, but we don't have an exact date of his birth. But it's believed that Siddhartha was a prince, and the story around Siddhartha is that he is a prince who's brought up in his palace and hardly ever sees the outside world, until one day he goes on this trip outside the palace with someone who takes him outside. And this is the story of the 4 encounters in Buddhism. And on one trip, he sees an old man, and the person taking him, he doesn't understand why this person's old. He's been sheltered his whole life. He's never really been around old people. And the carriage driver tells him that's what happens to all of us. All of us get old. On the 2nd trip, he sees a sick man. He doesn't understand this as well. He's never seen sick people. He's been sheltered his whole life. And the man says, yep, that's what will happen to all of us. All of us will get sick one day. Then he sees a dead man on his 3rd trip. And the man tells him, we will all die one day. And it happens to all of us. And on the last trip, he sees a holy man who is sitting, meditating, trying to transcend or find enlightenment. And so the story goes that this was a turning point in Siddhartha's life, and he wanted to find out how to eliminate suffering. And so he decides to leave his wife and children, and he goes off to search out this answer to how to eliminate suffering from life. And so in the beginning, he meets what are called ascetics. And ascetics are people who deny themselves worldly pleasures. They hardly eat anything. They put themselves in, or they contort themselves in painful positions sometimes. And so this is what he practices. So the idea being that instead of trying to deny suffering, rather the ascetics would almost embrace suffering, not to try to hide from it, right? And so he becomes someone who has perfected this practice, and you can tell from this depiction of the sculpture, he was at one point like a skeleton. He became so thin and frail, but it doesn't work for him, and he realized this isn't the solution to suffering. And so the story then is one day he sits under a Bodhi tree and realizes that the path towards suffering is not trying to deny it, but going through the Four Noble Truths, and he gains enlightenment. So the Four Noble Truths is an important part of Buddhism, and it's the idea that suffering is an inherent part of life, and the cause of suffering is self-centered desire and attachment. The solution to eliminate desire and attachment is by achieving nirvana, and the way to nirvana is through the Eightfold Path. And so the Eightfold Path is also another important part of Buddhism. So we put Buddhism, though, in the realm of philosophy. This would be a religion that might be debated about whether or not it's a religion or a philosophy, because there's not necessarily, we have a founder, right, Buddha or Siddhartha, but there's not a sacred text in philosophy. In Buddhism, there's many texts. There's an origin story, but there's not necessarily a dogma, which means there's not a set of ideas that one must obey to in order to achieve. Except we have the suggestion that the way to end suffering in life is through the Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths. So, and then there's two sects or schools of thought in Buddhism, and one is the Theravada Buddhism, which was originated, it's one of the older schools of Buddhism, and then the Mahayana Buddhism, which originates in the 1st century CE. Okay, Daoism is another. Daoism or Taoism, they're both the same, is another one of these religions that balances the line between religion and philosophy. Lao Tzu was considered the founder, but he's not known to actually exist. We don't have any historical evidence about whether or not he existed, but the book of Lao Tzu is a book of both poetry and philosophy that it is thought that he had written. And so just like in Greek philosophy, the goal for Taoism was to find a constancy to all phenomena that exist in the world, right? And trying to find this universal truth. And for Taoism, a lot of this was done by leaving society, going off on one's own, and often this meant into nature, okay? If any of you read Into the Wild, I know some might be reading this in their English class or read it before. This might be a good way to think about the idea of Taoism, someone who goes off away from society, out on their own to gain some kind of individual happiness. This was the goal of Taoism. In a minute, we're going to talk about Confucianism, and a good way to think about the difference between those two is that, as I mentioned, Taoism seeks to find peace with the world, for an individual to find peace with the world. Confucianism, on the other hand, is looking to construct a world that is peaceful, right? So Confucianism is aiming towards constructing social behavior so that we could create a peaceful social world. Taoism, on the other hand, seeks to get out of the social world. Many of you have probably seen this symbol in the top left, the yin yang, and what this represents is that the idea in Taoism that it is difficult to have a duality in the world. And so a way to think about that is that there are good things in good and evil perhaps are not completely separated, that one exists within another and within the other. That might be a tough concept, but that's the idea of Taoism. Okay, and Confucianism is started with Confucius, of course, who was born in the Warring States period, just prior to the Zhao dynasty. I'm sorry, just after the Zhao dynasty. And he's known for creating a book called the Analects, which is a compilation of actually 20 different books that contains Confucius, his philosophy. And so a good way to think about this is in comparison to Lao Tzu, like I said, this is a way for people to behave socially. Maybe you could think of this as in terms, and there's this idea of li, or propriety, and this is the way that someone behaves in all situations in their life, right? Comport means to essentially to behave in a proper way. And so you might think of like advice columns in newspapers, right? Or people who write in to people to say like, oh, I'm having this problem in my life, like how should I behave? Or you could think of like etiquette, the way that we talk about how someone should behave at the dinner table or in social situations. This is kind of what Confucius taught. And so there's also the idea of Confucius taught among a whole array of subjects. And so it was both how to behave, but also what is goodness, and what does it mean to be a good person, and the conclusion that Confucius comes to is that everyone has a role to fill in society, or to fulfill, rather, in society. And so Confucius's goal really was expansive, or his philosophy was very expansive or broad. So he had teachings on, like I said, moral conduct, how to behave, but this included speech, how people should talk. It included rules in government, how people should work in government, how people should write literature, how music should be prepared, how rituals should go about. So it was very expansive. And so if there's one thing that you remember about Confucianism is that it's hierarchical, right? That social structures are something that we need, and that as long as people behave within those social structures, the world will go on successfully and happily. All right, and so finally, I just want to mention how some of these philosophies translate to the way it affected women in these civilizations. And so in Confucianism, you can imagine, because it's this hierarchical model where people need to follow their social roles, it had a masculine quality to it. And that men possessed a higher role in society than women. Daoism, on the other hand, broke with this tradition, and Daoism essentially has this quality that is feminine and permissive, and that withdrawing socially was something that tended to affect women better in Taoist philosophy. In Greece, on the other hand, a good way to think about the effects of philosophy would be to compare Athens and Sparta. Now, the people practicing philosophy, the people I mentioned, Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, were all men. And for the most part, in Athens and other Greek city-states, women still played a quite submissive role, and typically in three areas: marriage, inheritance, and civic life. And so women often did not have a choice in who they were going to marry. This was something that was determined for them. In Sparta, on the other hand, the women in Sparta were not necessarily married off immediately. It's important to note, though, that the civic life, or being a citizen of Sparta or of Athens, being a citizen of these city-states, was highly intertwined with their identity. And so the role for both Spartans and Athenians, those women of those city-states, was to produce children for the state, which sounds like a very radical way of thinking about what it means to have offspring and have children. And so we like to think that in Sparta, women possessed somewhat more equality than in other places. Something to keep in mind, though, is that most of the knowledge that we have about women in Sparta comes from Athenians. A lot of the history comes from Athenians. So, but we do know that they had some more equality in education, that women were taught alongside men, beginning in Greece. And that they were supposed to take care of the interests of the state while the men are at war. But however, saying this, women in Sparta were still forbidden to speak in politics, and they were known to give their opinion through the men. And they were still not allowed to own, or I'm sorry, they could own property in Sparta, but still this was limited. Okay, so just some questions for you to consider for the class. Is this useful? Is philosophy in general useful? Can you see how it could be useful for your life? And do people use philosophy in their everyday lives? And I know many of you have gone over Plato's allegory of the cave. And so a big message in that story is that ideas can be profound and can change people dramatically. So think about an idea, something that you have learned in your life that has profoundly changed you, and that you are never the same after you learn this idea. So think about those and bring those with you to class. And thanks for listening.